The man knew he had been compromised the moment the phone stopped ringing. Outside, snow pressed against the windows of the safe apartment, dulling the sound of the city. Inside, classified documents were already burning names, routes, contact codes, entire lives curling into ash inside a metal sink. Somewhere down the street, a car engine idled longer than it should have. That pause was deliberate. That pause was the signal. He reached for the coded radio, then stopped, because the truth was far more dangerous than being caught. One intelligence service had been watching him for months. The other had been inside his network for years. What neither side knew yet was who he was really working for. If you love espionage stories, history buried on purpose, hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Give this video a like and share it with someone who lives for intelligence wars and secret histories. And tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? I love seeing how far these shadow stories travel across the world. Now, let's rewind. The Cold War is usually told as a simple story. Washington versus Moscow, capitalism versus communism. Two superpowers staring each other down across a divided world, but beneath that familiar narrative existed another conflict, quiet, complex, and deliberately forgotten. A war fought without declarations, uniforms, or public victories. A war fought in whispers. At the center of it were two intelligence services that history never paired together, Mossad and the KGB. To understand how this rivalry began, you have to understand the world they were born into. In the late 1940s, the world was not yet neatly divided. It was fractured, traumatized, and unstable. Europe lay in ruins. Millions were displaced. Borders existed more on paper than on the ground. Governments were rebuilding, but trust was gone. The Soviet Union emerged from World War II victorious, but deeply paranoid. It had lost tens of millions of people, and its leadership believed that enemies were everywhere. Espionage was no longer a tool of policy. It was a tool of survival. The KGB was shaped by this worldview. It was not merely an intelligence agency. It was an instrument of control, tasked with protecting ideology, monitoring loyalty, and shaping realities far beyond Soviet borders. At the same time, a very different intelligence service was being born. Mossad did not emerge from power or empire. It emerged from fear. The new state of Israel was diplomatically isolated and militarily vulnerable. It faced hostility on multiple fronts and understood that survival depended on information knowing what others were planning before they acted. Mossad's early operatives were not traditional spies. Many were survivors, linguists, smugglers, resistance fighters, and organizers who understood underground life better than any training manual could teach. Its intelligence culture was improvised, personal, and intensely human. At first, there was no reason for Mossad and the KGB to clash. In fact, for a brief moment in history, they stood on the same side. In the earliest years after Israel's founding, the Soviet Union viewed the new state with cautious interest. Western colonial powers had dominated the Middle East for decades, and Moscow saw an opportunity to weaken that influence. Some Soviet planners believed Israel might lean socialist or, at least, remain neutral. That assumption didn't last. As Israel's alignment with the West became clearer, Soviet attitudes hardened, but intelligence relationships don't change overnight. Networks already built do not simply disappear, they adapt. The KGB had long monitored Jewish communities across Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and the Middle East. These communities were multilingual, mobile, and transnational, to intelligence agencies that made them powerful, to counterintelligence agencies that made them dangerous. As migration routes opened and closed, as people moved from Soviet-controlled territory toward the Middle East, both Mossad and the KGB began watching the same human flowsage for very different reasons. Mossad saw lifelines, the KGB saw vulnerabilities. That is where the rivalry truly began. Espionage wars do not begin with gunfire. They begin with paperwork. Passenger lists, exit permits, cultural organizations, student groups, humanitarian committees. To the public, these were administrative systems. To intelligence agencies, they were maps revealing who moved, who disappeared, and who could be influenced. The KGB embedded itself deeply into organizations involved in cultural exchange and emigration. Officially, this was about security. Unofficially, it was about leverage. Mossad operatives working across Europe began noticing something disturbing. Meetings were compromised. Roots were exposed. Trusted intermediaries vanished without explanation. At first, Mossad assumed local authorities or rival regional services were responsible. They were wrong. The KGB was not merely observing from a distance, it was studying Mossad, learning how a smaller, agile intelligence service operated without the resources of an empire. And what the KGB discovered unsettled them. Mossad relied on precision, not scale, relationships, not mass surveillance, psychology, not ideology. Where the KGB sought to control populations, Mossad focused on individuals. This difference made direct confrontation difficult, but indirect clashes inevitable. Early encounters didn't look like battles. They looked like mistakes. A courier arrested at the wrong moment, a document intercepted too cleanly, a contact whose behavior subtly changed. At first, both sides blamed chance. Then the patterns became impossible to ignore. By the early 1950s, both agencies realized something unprecedented was happening. They were no longer operating independently. They were interfering with each other. The KGB began feeding selective information into channels Mossad monitored, not outright lies, but distortions designed to test reactions and decision-making. Mossad responded by allowing certain operations to be partially exposed, using surveillance itself as a tool to identify handlers and priorities. This was not open war. It was silent fencing. Neither side wanted exposure. Neither side wanted escalation. But both sides were learning and adapting. This rivalry does not appear in most Cold War histories because it complicates the narrative. It blurs ideological lines. It contradicts official alliances. It reveals how intelligence agencies often operate independently of diplomacy. Most of the people involved never defected. They never wrote memoirs. Their files were buried, fragmented, or quietly erased. Their success depended on invisibility. By the end of this early period, Mossad and the KGB understood one thing clearly. They were now permanent fixtures in each other's operational world. Not allies, not public enemies, but rivals in the dark. And then someone broke the unspoken rules. Someone crossed from observation into betrayal. That single decision would pull both agencies into a deeper, far more dangerous intelligence war. The most dangerous moment in any intelligence war is not when bullets are fired, it is when trust collapses. By the mid-1950s, Mossad and the KGB were no longer circling each other cautiously. The phase of observation was over. Both sides now understood they were operating inside the same human terrain. That terrain was unstable. The battlefield was not a city or a border. It was the human mind. Double agents were not a Cold War invention. But during this period, they became something far more strategic. For the KGB, double agents were instruments of control. They were not always volunteers. Many were coerced, pressured through family members, legal threats, or ideological manipulation. Loyalty, in Soviet intelligence doctrine, was something to be engineered. Mossad approached the concept differently. Rather than forcing compliance, Mossad sought psychological leverage: identity, fear, ambition, guilt. Recruitment often began with conversation, not confrontation. This difference created a volatile overlap, because when the same individual was approached by both sides, the result was rarely loyalty to either. It was survival. As Jewish migration from Eastern Europe intensified, intelligence services followed closely. Officially, these movements were humanitarian. Unofficially, they became intelligence pipelines. Every emigrant carried potential information about local officials, military units, infrastructure, and political sentiment. Mossad saw opportunity. The KGB saw risk. The KGB embedded handlers within migration processes, monitoring who left, who stayed, and who returned. Mossad embedded questions into interviews, resettlement programs, and community support networks. In some cases, the same individual was debriefed twice, once by Mossad, once by the KGB side, unaware of the other's involvement. In other cases, both sides knew and chose to continue anyway. This period produced a new type of intelligence asset, the performer. These individuals did not fully defect. They adapted. They learned what each side wanted to hear and delivered just enough truth to remain valuable. The KGB believed it could control such assets indefinitely. Mossad believed it could read them. Both were wrong at least some of the time. Files from this era show repeated cases of operations collapsing, not because of betrayal, but because of overconfidence. Each agency assumed it understood the human variable better than the other. It didn't. At some point in the late 1950s, Mossad realized something deeply unsettling. The KGB knew operational details it should not have known. Not general patterns, not educated guesses. Specifics, meeting locations, courier schedules, internal disagreements. This wasn't surveillance, this was penetration. An internal review began quietly. No panic, no accusations. Mossad leadership understood that reacting too aggressively would expose weaknesses. Instead, they changed nothing, at least not visibly. Mossad's response was subtle and dangerous. They began running controlled operations missions designed not to succeed, but to be watched. Information was intentionally leaked through channels suspected of compromise. If the KGB acted on it, Mossad would know where the leak lived. The KGB, for its part, suspected deception. It responded by delaying reactions, feeding back modified intelligence, and testing Mossad's patience. This created a feedback loop of mistrust. Both agencies were now spying not just on each other, but on their own information flows. Cold War mythology often paints defectors as truth-tellers. Reality was messier. Some defectors exaggerated. Some lied to protect themselves. Some arrived already shaped by their handlers. Both Mossad and the KGB learned that defection did not mean honesty. It meant negotiation. Each defector was a puzzle. How much truth were they giving? How much were they withholding? And how much had been planted deliberately? In several cases, defectors provided accurate tactical details, but false strategic narratives, misleading intelligence that shaped long-term planning. Those were the most damaging. This rivalry was not limited to documents and meetings. It became personal. Families were pressured. Careers were destroyed quietly. Reputations were dismantled through whispers rather than arrests. The KGB specialized in pressure. Mossad specialized in isolation. Targets found themselves cut off from support systems, unsure who to trust, unsure whether silence or cooperation was safer. Some broke, others vanished, and a few played both sides, brilliantly until they didn't. The turning point came when one intelligence asset disappeared without explanation. No arrest, no defection announcement, no body, just absence. Both Mossad and the KGB believed the other side had taken him. They were both wrong. The asset had gone underground, taking with him operational knowledge that neither side could afford to lose. Worse, he left behind evidence suggesting intentional manipulation of both agencies. For the first time, Mossad and the KGB had to confront an uncomfortable truth. They were not always the hunters. Sometimes they were the prey. By the early 1960s, the center of gravity shifted. Europe was saturated. Too many eyes, too many compromises. The Middle East offered space, chaos, and deniability. The KGB expanded advisory roles, intelligence training, and covert influence operations across the region. Mossad expanded counter-networks, deep cover assets, and rapid response intelligence cells. The rivalry followed. What began as quiet interference in Europe now moved into a region already boiling with conflict. And unlike Europe, mistakes here had consequences measured not in files but in lives. By the end of this chapter in the story, the rivalry had evolved. This was no longer a contest of observation. It was an intelligence war, with real-world consequences, one that would soon intersect with open conflict, proxy wars, and regional upheaval. Both Mossad and the KGB entered the next phase, carrying the same realization. They could no longer afford ambiguity. Someone had to be neutralized. Someone had to disappear, and some secrets could not be allowed to surface. The shadows were no longer quiet, and in the Middle East, intelligence mistakes echo loudly. By the early 1960s, the intelligence war between Mossad and the KGB had outgrown Europe. Too many eyes, too many borders, too many compromises. The Middle East offered something different: space, volatility, and deniability. Governments changed overnight. Alliances shifted without warning. Conflicts created chaos, and chaos created cover. For intelligence services, it was the perfect environment. The Middle East was not introduced to espionage by the Cold War. It had long been a crossroads of empires, trade routes, and political intrigue. What changed during this period was scale. Superpower competition intensified local rivalries. Regional disputes became proxy battlegrounds. Intelligence agencies no longer observed conflicts from afar. They embedded themselves inside them. The KGB expanded advisory roles across the region. These were presented as technical, military, or political assistance, but they served another purpose: intelligence access. Mossad recognized the shift immediately. What had once been a European shadow game was now unfolding closer to home, with far higher stakes. Soviet intelligence presence in the region rarely looked like espionage. It looked like training programs, military advisors, security consultants, diplomatic staff. But behind those roles were handlers, analysts, and covert operatives building long-term influence networks. These networks collected information, shaped decisions, and quietly identified individuals who could be recruited, pressured, or neutralized. Mossad countered with a different approach. Instead of embedding in institutions, it embedded in relationships. Journalists, business figures, logistics coordinators, and regional intermediaries became nodes in a growing intelligence web. This was not a clash of armies. It was a clash of ecosystems. Diplomatic missions became some of the most heavily contested spaces in the region. Every reception, meeting, and cultural event carried intelligence weight. Conversations were mapped, patterns were tracked. Loyalty was constantly evaluated. The KGB viewed embassies as control hubs. Information flowed upward, analyzed centrally, then redistributed strategically. Mossad treated embassies differently. They saw them as listening post, places where tension revealed more than statements ever could. Who avoided whom? Who arrived early? Who left abruptly? The smallest details mattered. In this environment, misreading a gesture could cost an Asator trigger an international incident. As regional conflicts escalated, intelligence agencies moved closer to the fighting without crossing visible lines. The KGB provided intelligence support that shaped military planning. Mossad responded with counterintelligence designed to distort those plans quietly. False assumptions became weapons, a delayed message, a misinterpreted signal. An operation launched a day too late. Neither side claimed responsibility. That was the point. The war remained invisible even as its consequences became very real. Not every intelligence victory involved recruitment or deception. Some involved removal. Operatives disappeared. Intermediaries were silenced. Individuals who knew too much were neutralized without public explanation. These were not dramatic operations designed to send messages. They were quiet, surgical actions meant to close files permanently. The KGB favored pressure and containment. Mossad favored speed and finality. Both methods left trails, but only to those trained to see them. And both sides knew they were being watched. At one point, a single operation threatened to expose everything. A coordinated intelligence effort, misjudged by both sides, created visible ripples across multiple countries. Diplomatic tensions rose. Security services asked questions they were not supposed to ask. For a brief moment, it looked as if the shadow war might surface. It didn't. Both Mossad and the KGB pulled back just enough to preserve deniability. Assets were burned, files were buried, careers ended quietly. The lesson was clear. Exposure was the only true defeat. Behind every successful operation were people who paid the price. Assets who could never return home, families left without answers, operatives who vanished into anonymity. The intelligence war consumed lives without recognition or memorials. There were no medals for surviving suspicion, no monuments for those erased. Both agencies accepted this cost as unavoidable, but privately, it changed how they operated. Risk tolerance narrowed, trust thresholds rose. Decisions became colder. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Mossad and the KGB no longer treated each other as abstract competitors. They anticipated each other's moves. They designed operations assuming interference. They measured success not by what happened, but by what didn't. The rivalry had matured into something dangerous. Mutual understanding without trust, each side knew the other was capable of patience, deception, and ruthless adaptation. And neither believed the other would stop. As global politics shifted and the Cold War showed signs of strain, intelligence agencies adapted faster than governments. The KGB began preparing for uncertainty, internal instability, ideological erosion, and unpredictable futures. Mossad prepared for continuity, assuming that even if states changed, intelligence networks would remain. Both assumptions would soon be tested, because the Cold War was approaching its final phase. But intelligence wars do not end when flags come down, they evolve. And when one empire began to collapse, the shadows didn't disappear, they scattered. Empires rarely collapse the way people imagine. There is no single moment, no final announcement, no clean ending. There is confusion, fragmentation, and silence. And for intelligence agencies, collapse is not an end at all. It is a transformation. By the late 1980s, the Soviet system was visibly cracking. Economic strain, political uncertainty, and internal dissent weakened the structures that had sustained the KGB for decades. Files were delayed, budgets shrank, chains of command blurred. But intelligence networks do not disappear simply because governments weaken. They adapt, fragment, and sometimes go rogue. Mossad watched carefully. Instability inside a rival intelligence service was both an opportunity and a danger. Loose networks could be exploited, but they could also act unpredictably. The rules that had governed the rivalry were beginning to dissolve. As Soviet authority eroded, KGB officers faced impossible choices. Some remained loyal to an idea that no longer functioned. Some shifted allegiance quietly. Others focused on survival, protecting assets, files, and identities. Information became currency. Files were copied. Contacts were sold. Old secrets found new buyers. For Mossad, this created a new intelligence landscape. The enemy was no longer a centralized institution. It was a scattered web of former operatives, dormant assets, and unfinished operations. Many KGB networks in the Middle East did not collapse with the Soviet Union. They went silent. Handlers disappeared, but assets remained. Training endured. Tradecraft survived. These networks adapted to new political realities, sometimes integrating into local intelligence structures, sometimes operating independently. Mossad understood this immediately. A network that stops communicating is not dead, it is waning. Counterintelligence efforts shifted from confrontation to monitoring. The goal was no longer to defeat the KGB, but to understand what it had left behind. Not all files were recovered. Some were destroyed deliberately, others vanished. A few were never found at all. These missing files contained identities double agents, intermediaries, and individuals who had played both sides for years. Some of those people reinvented themselves. Others lived quietly, knowing too much and saying nothing. And at least one of them connects directly back to the man in the opening scene. The man burning documents in that snow-covered apartment was not a traitor in the traditional sense. He was a survivor of the transition. Recruited during the height of the Cold War, manipulated by competing intelligence services, and ultimately abandoned when the structures that controlled him collapsed. He wasn't working for Mossad. He wasn't loyal to the KGB. He was protecting himself. The documents he destroyed were not operational plans. They were names proof that the intelligence war had never truly ended, only gone underground. This intelligence war is rarely discussed because it doesn't fit clean narratives. It doesn't offer heroes or villains, it doesn't align neatly with ideology, and it doesn't end. Both Mossad and the KGB then, exposure would raise questions no one wanted answered. Who authorized certain operations, who controlled which assets, and how many decisions were shaped by intelligence rather than policy. Silence protected everyone. The legacy of this rivalry still echoes today. Tradecraft developed during this period remains in use. Networks seeded decades ago still influence regional intelligence dynamics, and the lessons learned about deception, patience, and human vulnerability continue to shape modern espionage. The Cold War may have ended. The Shadow War did not. It simply changed form. They fought through people, through trust, through silence. And because of that, their conflict left no monuments, only shadows. Shadows that still move. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the part history allows us to see. If you want more hidden intelligence wars, stories buried beneath official narratives, and shadow conflicts nobody talks about, subscribe to Spy Shadows so you don't miss what comes next, because the next story is even deeper in the dark.